Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Tone. I'm your host, Mork Marshall. In this week's podcast, we're going to discuss volume wars. And what I mean by that is the conflicts that arise between guitarists with amplifiers and sound crew. I'm going to look at both sides and try to think of ways that we can negotiate or try to deal with these conflicts. Before I get into that, though, I want to mention that I've completed a few new blogs for my website, anatomyofguitartone.com. The first one being about the FabFilter Pro Q3 plugin, which is my go-to favorite parametric EQ plugin. I think it just sounds the best. I know some people will say that a lot of parametric EQ plugins are transparent. I don't see that to be the case, or I should say hear that to be the case, because I can hear the difference between the stock Logic and the stock Pro Tools parametric EQ plugins and FabFilter, and I don't like the Logic and the Pro Tools parametric EQ plugins, and a lot of other ones I've tried too. They have a sound, and it doesn't match my taste. So the FabFilter, though, is fabulous. It really is as transparent as you can get in a very flattering way, and the features on it are really incredible. I use it anytime I need more of a surgical style EQ as opposed to like a tone shaping EQ. You go to my website, you could read more about the many features that are involved in this plugin, which I've been using for a number of years. I also uploaded a blog about the Toll G12 microphone, which I spoke about in the last podcast, as well as the Sarno Earth Drive, which has become one of my favorite overdrive and saturation pedals. And you can hear a lot of examples that I used in the podcast on the same topic, but more searchable if you just want to go to the site and check out some examples quick. You don't have to scroll through a podcast. All right, well, I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been up to in the past couple of weeks. I've been digging into some 20th century harmony and polychords a lot. If you don't know what polychords are, there are two independent triads stacked on top of each other, and they each remain independent. So if you have a G chord playing on the bottom and then you have an A flat chord playing on the top, they're not intermingling so much with the notes overlapping each other within the same octave. They're separated up to by an octave. So you hear both triads distinctly, but the way that they stack on top of each other really creates some sonic density that can evoke very specific emotions, which I like. So I'm working on a cue now that's of probably the 70s, 80s or genre, and I'm using polychords to create this feeling of uneasiness, but they're not completely dissonant. I mean, you can adjust, depending on which triads you stack on top of each other, levels of spiciness, as my mentors would say, how spicy you want it. They don't have to be completely dissonant, and in the circumstance where I use them, they are mildly dissonant, so they just evoke a feeling that something is familiar but off and not quite right. There's a great book called 20th Century Harmony that you should check out, which covers a lot of these topics, as well as I give lessons on harmony and music theory, guitar playing, composition, music production. If you want to dig deeper into any of these topics, you can reach me at anatomyofguitartone.com to discuss if we could be a good match. Now, I've really been going back to my roots of teaching in person more or on Zoom. And I don't mean in person necessarily like you have to be in New York and come to my apartment, but I mean as opposed to having pre-taped videos. So I was getting into YouTube and pre-taped videos for a while, but I've started to move away from that because I think I've just been recognizing how impactful one-to-one lessons have been for me, whether I'm studying with Douglas Gibson or, Mark Marshall or Victoria Bond, my mentors who I still study with. I just really feel like there's something extra that you get from an interaction with somebody in person. Again, it could just be over Zoom, which is how I'm teaching most of my lessons these days, but being able to communicate, and for me as a teacher to be able to structure and change the way I'm explaining something for somebody to be able to understand it, I feel how impactful that's been for me. And I'm really feeling like my niche is being able to do that for other people as well, as opposed to putting prepackaged material together that's more general. The information I have might not be that different, but the way I relay it or try to explain it can be make all the difference between somebody feeling blurry about a topic and it really landing and being very centered with the concept. So I'm available for private lessons. If you want to reach out to my website and you feel like this might be what you're seeking, and you've tried videos and you feel like they're not fully paying off for you, send me a note. Let's talk. All right, let's get into the concept of volume wars here. This is such a difficult topic because it's just always a conflict on gigs. I mean, most of the time I show up to a gig, I'm expecting somewhat of a conflict with the sound person about volume, being a guitarist that plays electric guitar, right? It's a little easier when you play acoustic guitar because you don't often show up with an amplifier. You're usually running DI, and the sound person likes that because they have complete control of the signal. And when you show up with an amplifier, all of a sudden it's limiting their control. And I'm not going to get too deep into that quite yet, but let's just start off with some of the inherent issues of why this is an issue for guitar players. So the thing is that the guitar amplifier was invented to make the guitar, the electric guitar, or at that time it was more almost an acoustic guitar archtop with a pickup on it, to be louder, to make it sit above horn section and a drummer. Because the guitar itself, if you play a archtop or an acoustic, they're fairly loud, but not enough to compete with. I mean, horns are loud. I still think a horn section is louder than me playing a guitar amp, a pretty loud guitar amp on a gig. Most of the time, it's incredible what they project, right? But the idea of the guitar amp was, okay, we have to find a way to make this louder so it could be audible. One thing that happened in that process is that they didn't have, at the time, it took quite a lot of time actually, until the late 50s, early 60s, to have amps that could be very loud and not overdrive or distort. They would have lower wattage amps, and guitar players would push them in order to compete with a loud band, and they'd start to get crunchy. Guitar players really liked this sound. Leo Fender, who was one of the earlier developers of the guitar amplifier, not the first, but one of the early ones, and one of the longest running, as the Fender Corporation is still around today, saw this overdrive as being a defect in the engineering and the design, and he kept trying to design amplifiers to avoid this distortion, which he saw as a flaw, which is really interesting because that flaw was in a lot of ways what defined amplifiers more than anything, is how they saturate, how early they saturate, and some guitar players sought out amps that didn't saturate at all, and then a lot of us probably more often sought out amplifiers that would overdrive in a specific way. Now, Leo Fender, along with Dick Dale, actually, the surf guitar player, were working to develop a guitar amplifier that could be louder and represent the clean tone more. Dick Dale was blowing up amplifiers. He was just playing them full up and really wanted more of a clean sound. And they eventually came up with the Bandmaster, which is a pretty loud, clean amplifier. And at the same time, the size of venues that musicians were playing were changing. They were getting bigger, and you had to have a louder amplifier in order to compete just with the rooms. So the amps were getting bigger, the rooms were getting bigger, PAs weren't really sufficient at that time as a means to mic a guitar amplifier to have it be heard more. It was mainly just used for vocals, and they probably still weren't even loud enough when a singer was singing. And there was obviously a need for louder amps due to the environment and for the desire of tone. What's interesting that happened is that we've kind of been reversing that nowadays. Music venues keep getting smaller and smaller, and so if we're playing with these really loud guitar amplifiers that were used to play in bigger venues, we run into a conflict if we want to use those amplifiers to saturate and get an overdriven tone out of them in these smaller environments. So we have to consider the wattage of the amplifier to the scenario, or the setup of the room, the venue that we're playing, in order to make sure that we're not using too powerful of an amp for a room. I even feel like those Blues DeVilles are way too much power for most rooms. They put out a lot of clean volume, which means you have a lot of headroom. So if you push the amplifier, it's going to be really loud. If you push a fuzz pedal or a booster pedal into it, it's going to be really loud and uncontrollable. It makes it really hard to manage as a guitar player if that's what's in the back line and you're showing up to a gig, often you don't have very much time to set up and get a sound, and you're being surprised sometimes by the sheer volume of the amplifier. One way I've dealt with this is to have several amplifiers I use for gigs. I have a small Tweed Champ, which is like a 5-watt amp. I've got a Princeton, which is like a 12-watt amp. I've got a Tweed Pro, which is like a 28-watt amp. And that's about as high as I go, 30 watts. I'll use AC30 sometimes on gigs. That's all I found I needed for the sounds that I'm going for on a gig. And the AC30, I can never even really open that up fully, as well as the Victoria 35115, which is the Tweed Pro I use. I can't always open that up as well because it's a lot of power. I actually have to be in a pretty big-sized room in order to be able to open that up. Even sometimes theaters sometimes can't handle it. Really don't need much more if you like a little bit of an overdriven sound to be pushing over 30 watts, and definitely not in a small club. But even when I'm taking different size amplifiers, I still deal with conflict because it's just the rooms change. Some rooms have different acoustics in them, and you might get more of a high-end content or echo content, or just the reflections change. Some rooms absorb sound more, and when you push your volume amplifier, it can take it more. So you don't always know what you're walking into. In New York City, I have a bit of an idea of what clubs I've been playing and what the rooms sound like. So since I played there a number of times, I can estimate what I'm going to need for that venue. Even when I was on tour, I had a couple of amps in the truck, and I would have one that was for bigger festival stages and bigger theaters that we were playing. And then if we were doing smaller, like sometimes we do these record shop performances, and they were short performances where the artist would sign vinyls and stuff afterwards. And I would have a smaller, like style, Tweed Deluxe style amp, and I would use for those gigs, or if we ended up playing a radio recording or something of that nature, to be able to make sure that I was pairing something for the environment, and that way I could get my sound, because my sound was coming from the amplifier a lot. I was using pedals, but more as a complement to the amplifier, not to get that overdriven tube sound, which is difficult because I'm relying on that push tube sound, and that requires the amp to push some volume in order to get that. I've tried a number of other different scenarios, such as just using drive pedals to capture that sound, and it doesn't really work aside from the Effectrode tube drive paired with the Effectrode PC2A. There's something about the tube drive that I still need to push some volume from the amplifier. It doesn't have to be as much as I would if I want to get the amp to saturate, but it's one of the only pedals, in fact, it's the only pedal that I've used that really acts and sounds like an amp being pushed. The PC2A I place after the tube drive in order to emulate a little bit of that tube sag when I really want to get that sound of the amp being pushed to its absolute limit. So those two pedals I use when I end up in a room and on a stage with a really loud amp like a twin reverb or something. I know that amp is not going to break up and it's unreasonably loud, so I use the Effectrode pedals in order to be able to achieve that. So that actually works. In a pinch where I'm not going to use the amp for that case, and a lot of other times too, I always have those pedals on because that's like my bass sound for dealing with getting a saturated sound, like a bass tone for my sound. But other situations I've tried, such as using amp attenuators, and like using those live for a couple of reasons. One, I still need to push some volume through the speaker to get some sound. And two, I found it didn't sound exactly the same as my amp. It was good. I was getting past saturation from the amp. I found them finicky to get working on the gig, especially festival gigs where I had to set up really quick and didn't really have much time. It was just not great, and having to, if you're teching yourself, to reach behind the amp and plug in all the speaker wires, make sure everything's up and running. You don't get a line check. Well, I guess basically you get a line check, if that, and then you're on. I just didn't find it the most friendly to use in those fast fire situations, though I didn't love that. I don't love using amp modelers. I don't think that they sound as good and they don't feel as good. Sometimes you have to use them. It's just a requirement of the gigs and theater type shows, but I never opt for using them myself. In-ears, as great as they can be, unless you have a really expensive pair of in-ears, you're not going to really get the full picture of the band. So I find those to be problematic sometimes too, even though they're great in the sense that it's the clearest you'll ever hear everybody in the band. So they do have their pros if you especially get a great pair of in-ears, but that only solves the audibility issues of being able to hear yourself. It doesn't solve the amplifier as an instrument and trying to get that amplifier, that instrument, to be able to sing and reacts differently at different volumes. And that's something that sound people that aren't guitar players don't understand. They see the guitar amplifier as like a PA. Oh, it just makes your sound louder, but it doesn't, right? On a tube amp, every volume notch you go up, the compression, the saturation, the tonality of the amplifier changes. And that's why we tend to be very particular about the volume we're playing at now. I say that with mind that there are guitarists that know what they're doing. Sometimes guitar players are a little in the dark about all of this, and they just play loud because they play loud, and they don't even have a purpose for doing it. They're not conscious of how volume is projecting and what's happening. I think it's important for guitarists to be responsible and understand if they're playing loud, why they're playing loud, and not just have a brick wall sound. I've seen some rhythm guitar players that don't know how to operate amps super well or pedals. They just have one brick wall volume that they play at the whole night, and it's often too loud and it buries everything. You have to play with dynamics. As a lead guitar player, or as a second guitar player that backs up a lot of other guitar players or songwriters, I use a lot of volume changes in my sound. So I have a lead sound and I have a rhythm sound. The rhythm sound is pulled back, so it is I'm doing live automation. It sits below the vocals, and then when it's time for me to do a solo or there's a part that I really have to punctuate, I bring up my volume in order to punch a little harder. Now there's two ways I deal with this. One way is to ride my guitar volume. As I turn my guitar volume down, it cleans up my sound and I get a little bit of a cleaner tone, and as I turn the volume up, my tone gets more saturated. This is like the really old school way of doing it, and I love this for the blues and a lot of rock and roll, but there are times when you need a very saturated sound. Maybe your thing is like punk or metal and you need that saturated sound all the time. The solution for this is to place a volume pedal at the end of your gain chain. Ride that as the vocalist is singing. That way you can take your fully saturated sound and tuck it below. Now I know you're going to lose a little tone with this procedure, but we have to accept a little bit of loss there. When you have your chance, when you're going to boost and play your solos and play intros and instrumental sections where you can really riff and get those parts out, it's going to sound really awesome and your sound will come across. But what you're going to do is you're going to leave headroom for everything else in the band. Everything does have to breathe. You can't just come on and just be blasting everything at full volume the whole gig. It's going to get fatiguing. The sound person is going to get really frustrated, and there's going to be a point probably where you're burying the vocals and there's nothing they can do about it, which is why some sound people will complain about the guitar volume. First of all, they're very worried about not having enough headroom. A lot of times the PAs are underpowered and there's only so much room they have to be able to get the vocals audible so the audience can actually hear the singer. You have to be mindful of that. And they meaning the sound crew is shell-shocked often a lot from guitar players not knowing how to use their volume. Let's discuss some options for amp placement and techniques of dealing with our amplifiers, our instruments on stage when we like to saturate our amp and push out a little bit more volume. The first one would be the amp angle. Don't point your amp straight at the sound person. Amps are very pointy, and the further you get away from them, they tend to have more high end than low end, and they're going to sound harsh. If you're facing your amp directly at the sound person or the audience, you're going to experience conflict. I like to angle my amp, if I can, so that it points up towards my head. Some people have used a chair in the past to raise their amp up, but I feel like then it's just my back that's getting the amplifier. Angling it allows me to be able to point it towards my head, which allows me to understand the volume that I'm playing at and truly what frequencies are coming out of the amplifier. Sometimes when it's pointing at your legs, you don't think it has enough high end, and so you turn up the high end, and really out 10 feet in front of your amp, it's really bright. So, which brings up another point. If you have no other option but to face your amp forward, walk 10 feet out or 15 feet out in front of the amplifier and play and listen to what's happening out front. You're going to be quite surprised by the projection of the volume and the sound and the tone is going to be a little different than how you perceived it on stage. I wish that venues had devices or some sort of wooden contraption setup that would immediately just have the availability to angle your amp back and towards your head. It would really save some battles that happen between the guitarists and the sound crew. And clubs, I don't feel, do this enough. They don't set up solutions that can reduce conflict. Another option that can reduce conflict is using plexiglass. I don't know why every venue on earth does not have several pieces of plexiglass in their back line for use with guitar amplifiers and just anything else that may be loud coming from stage. It makes no sense to me because it's such an effective tool for countering the pointy, sharp nature of guitar amplifiers. They're immediately putting you at a disadvantage when you show up and it's a stage and maybe it's a loud room and there's a lot of reflections, or you're set up in a manner that the amp is definitely going to hit the sound person or the front row of the audience. Why do they not have plexiglass? I don't get it, because it is an amazing tool that can really be a problem solver when it comes to this conflict of volume. Right? I bought plexiglass and I take it to many gigs. I used to have a couple of sheets, or I'd say plexiglass barriers, in my road case, depending on what gigs we were playing on the road. And honestly, most gigs I would use the plexiglass on, often even on festival stages. There's one thing I did like about it, aside from the volume control, which we'll talk about in a second, is it shoots the sound in an upward direction. I don't like hearing my guitar through monitors. I just don't like the way that it sounds. So I don't put almost anything in my monitors on stage. I can usually hear everybody on the stage. Allows me to balance my sound with the acoustic sound of the instruments, which brings up that topic of make sure that you're not balancing your volume of your amplifier with a monitor mix that's coming through the monitors. I suggest everybody set their volumes to each other on stage with the monitors off. Get your sound balanced on stage. Make sure everybody is not blasting each other out. Everybody can be heard. If you're balanced on stage, it makes it so much easier to reproduce the sound out front. One of the issues that happens is all of a sudden people start getting really loud sounds through their monitors, and then they're competing with the monitors, but that's not really reflective of the sound coming off the stage. And all of a sudden you'll get in this position where you think you're loud enough, but you're actually way too loud because you're not understanding that you're out of context with the actual sound of the band leaving the stage. That's my method for all stages, and it's worked pretty well for me. I also use the plexiglass, so as I stand closer to the amplifier, I could always hear it if I feel like I'm getting buried a little bit. The sound pushes upward, I move back towards the amplifier, I hear my guitar loud and clear. The plexiglass takes away that sharp transient and brightness of the amplifier, and what you end up with is still volume, but it fills the room in a softer way. This gives the sound person more capability to use the microphone to put you in the PA to get a little bit more of that tack and brightness from it. But the plexiglass prevents that harshness and that knife-like treble attack and volume attack that you would get from sitting in front of the speaker. Now, I've heard some guitar players call it a sneeze guard or have detrimental things to say about it. I think that guitarists sometimes have an ego about volume, and we need to leave that behind, right? You will be heard. Right? If you use plexiglass, people are still going to hear your tone. In fact, they're going to hear it better because they don't hear it like you hear it. The plexiglass, to some degree, is actually going to allow them to hear your amp more like how you hear it when you're standing above the amplifier. And in some ways, it's almost more reflective of what your tone is going to sound like. And they're going to enjoy the show more because you're not just going to blow them out with volume, nor are you going to blow out the sound person. They'll be happier. There may be times where if you're playing loud enough, they still might not put you in the PA, but they're less likely to complain about it in the same way because it's not offensive, it's not harsh. And it's really the harshness, I find, that they're reacting to more times rather than just the overall volume of it. Get plexiglass. Clubs aren't going to stock it, and I think it's one of the best solutions to walk into a club if you have that. Immediately you're saying to the sound crew, like, hey, I'm here to make sure that we're going to start on good terms at least, right? And I've had so fewer issues when I show up with plexiglass. And if you're recording in the studio, I don't recommend using the plexiglass because of the plastic. It does reflect sound, and you can get some subtle phase issues with the microphone. I don't find them to be an issue for live recording. I mean, it's what's worse, you not getting your sound or having a little bit of phase cancellation. I feel like the phase cancellation is a lesser issue in a live situation, considering I would rather have the sustain and the compression from my amplifier because it affects the way I play. So I roll with it in a live situation. I don't worry about it. It's fairly cheap to buy. I just recommend going and getting some for yourself. Measure it, make sure it fully covers your speaker, and take it to a gig. Like, there have been times since I have the plexiglass that sound crew have said, oh, can you just pull it off the amp just a little bit, like let a little bit of the cone come through, because they want more, which is so rare as a guitar player that you hear the sound person do that, but then they're working with you rather than against you. And most of the times when you show up to sound check, they're working against you. I can't tell you how many times I've shown up with a small amp. I played BAM in Brooklyn, which is the Brooklyn Academy of Music. It was a very large room. I showed up with a Princeton reverb, my Headstrong Low King. It has a 12-inch speaker instead of a 10. For this particular gig, I wasn't playing the amp full out. I wanted somewhat of a clean tone from it, and I was using pedals for more saturation. I needed more of that clean, funky tone. I got the sound check first. I plugged in my Princeton, made sure everything was working well, and immediately the sound person was like, you got to come way down. I mean, I knew very well that that volume was not even going to be enough when the drummer started playing, but they were being so weird about my volume immediately. And I made the mistake of playing before the drummer played. There's no frame of reference. Immediately, their default is just to yell at the guitar player, right? They didn't even really introduce themselves. It's one of those deals where it's just you against them. It's like, if you're a sound person and the musicians show up and you're there, introduce yourself. And same thing to the musicians. If you show up, look for the sound person, say hello, learn their name, be friendly. You're on the same team together. You're likely to get a less, I would say prickly experience if you're respectful to one another. At least start out in a place of decency, right? I've just seen a lot of sound crew be disrespected, almost treated like servants, and musicians, sometimes artists, won't even make eye contact with them. It's like, oh, you're here to do that, whatever, right? And just don't even introduce them during the set and say thanks to the sound person running sound for me and working together. They don't show up with a stage plot. They're just not helpful. You want to try to make the sound person's job as easy as possible. That shows respect, that shows that you're serious about what you're doing, and allows them to do their job more effectively and be better at their job. They're going to get cranky a lot of times because you're not prepared and you're not respecting them. And if you do those two things, it will really help out the situation. Even when I do that, though, sometimes there arises the issue with the dreaded volume of the amplifier. There's a few things I've learned about dealing with this, and they're not ideal, but it's a reality of the situation. One is, I never test my guitar at full volume when I'm getting a sound check. It would be nice to, because then I'd get an idea of how my pedals are going to react with the amp volume that it's going to be. But it's going to always raise a flag to the sound person. Just immediately, they're just going to be grumpy and tell you that you're too loud. I wait until the drummer's playing, and even then I hold back a little bit until we're playing the first song in the set. The first song in the set, I'd love just to be ready to go, and there's my sound, and I know where it is. But because of the interaction often with sound crew, I'm talking about a sound person that you're not touring with. It's a bit different when you're touring with somebody that knows your sound, though the plexiglass is really important there too because of the ever-changing rooms. But most club gigs or just gigs around New York City or anywhere else, I hold back if there's a sound person because I know what's going to happen. They don't have any reference. If I kick a fuzz pedal on, a fuzz pedal's like throwing kerosene on a fire. They're going to hear this compressed sound and they're immediately going to go into a panic mode of being like, you're too loud. And there's a lot of times I know I'm not too loud because I have an idea of what the drums and bass are going to be like with the full band. But I hold back. I just hold back until the first song. I had issues where I've played full volume at sound check, and the sound person has complained, so I've turned the volume down. Then we start the first song, and by the second song, the artist is telling me turn up because they can't hear me enough. So now I'm out of balance with the band on stage, and the artist is not happy. And get in this situation of who am I listening here? Who am I serving? The sound person or the vocalist or the artist? And I always have to go with the artist. Plus, you have to remember that sound crew, if you're loading into a gig that you're not using your sound person that knows your music, they don't know your music. They also don't know the balance of how it's supposed to sound, and people have different opinions. I'm of the opinion that the band should balance itself on stage, and the sound person should just really complement that, but it depends on the size of the room you're playing. The issue is that sometimes you have let's say you have a band that's like My Bloody Valentine, which by the way is a really loud band, but that's not my point. The point is that it's a wall of sound, and the vocals are settled into the music with this wall of sound. You don't want it mixed like a pop track where the vocals are completely out front and the guitars are really low, which is a trend I'm seeing with a lot of mixing that's happening now. As I hear people, they want full control of everything. They don't know your music, and all of a sudden they're mixing your music like completely different than it's supposed to sound. So I don't always love that the sound person has complete control, or the control they want over your mix if they don't know your music. Now, if you're working with somebody that knows your music, then you can work on it together and figure out where things are supposed to sit. And almost always the sound person will miss your solos. So I boost for solos on stage, or like I was mentioning earlier, I use my volume knob or volume pedal to adjust the difference between like my rhythm or part playing and then when I take a solo, because they don't know the song, so they're going to miss it half the time. And sometimes I've seen some people, they're just not even paying attention. They're on their phone and they don't care, right? They're dealing with 5 bands a night. They're just burnt out, and not all of them, by the way, but they're letting you do the show, and then they're just kind of making sure their vocals and it sounds decent, right? So you have to control your show to some degree. I really like when everybody has an amplifier on stage. Keyboard players, I don't like DI instruments on stage. I'd much rather everybody has an amp and balances themselves responsibly, and then that way whatever comes out front of the stage is the sound, and maybe some things are enhanced with the PA, like some of the subs and stuff, but the band knows how they're supposed to sound. Well, hopefully it takes some work to get there and experience to know when everybody's playing at the right volume. But it goes back to the practice room too, is it just make sure that you're setting up in a way in a practice room that everybody can hear each other, and you can really get used to not only the volume, but what that volume feels like. So when you get on stage, you could replicate that. Pay attention to that. Avoid monitors and rehearsal for everything but vocals if you can. Just balance yourselves out. Make sure that you're getting an honest representation of what you sound like in the rehearsal room and how loud your amp is facing at you. So then when you step into these live situations, you have a better idea. And of course, the plexiglass. Use the plexiglass in rehearsal too and get used to it. There's a company called Clear Sonic which makes plexiglass shields for guitar amps, and I highly recommend them. Another issue that I feel like we all experience these days is that clubs aren't booking the appropriate music for the room. They just want to get people to come into the venue, and they're not looking and say, oh, this is a hardcore punk band. Well, this is like a 30-seat room that's very bright. Maybe this is not the right combination, because they're not going to play it quieter. I mean, they shouldn't, because it changes the expression of the music, and sometimes that's something that sound people don't understand. I think it's just like, oh, you just play quieter, right? Well, that's not really the type of music. If a punk drummer played like a lounge drummer, it wouldn't sound like punk anymore. And so if you're going to play hardcore punk or metal, you got to be hitting the drums to get that intensity out of it, because the intensity is part of the expression and the emotion. The same thing goes for a lot of different genres of music, and there's certain genres of music that are a complete opposite of that. Like, it needs to be played very delicate and very quiet in order to express the emotion that represents that style of music. There's a lack of responsibility here, obviously, with some venues that aren't considering this with the room, and they're not vetting the music that comes in. And sometimes we haven't played these rooms before, and then we show up and we're like, oh great, this is not the right room for us. This is not going to go well, because it's obviously we're going to overpower this room I encourage people to consider this themselves if they can scope out the venues that they're going to play before they play them. If you have the options of choosing other venues, try to find the right venues that are for you. Now, bigger venues are better for larger bands. It's a conflict because sometimes we can't draw that many people to play a bigger venue. So there are obviously some catches here that may limit us beyond that. But try to consider it as much as you can because it'll be a much better match for your band. Let's talk a bit about the sound person's perspective. I touched on a few things before about why some of them may be standoffish or seem a little bitter, and that is due to the lack of communication and organization that happens sometimes from the club themselves if they're being underpaid or not being given details that they need to do a show properly. It can also happen from, just as I mentioned before, the band's interaction. There's also the issue of the sound person's trying to do their best to make sure that a band sounds good. And some are more experienced than others, and some sound people are awesome at their job, but limited by the rooms that they're in, meaning there's only so much power in the PA, and they can only get whatever direct signals are as loud as the PA allows. The biggest problem with this is voice, right? And people do want to hear the vocals. They want to hear what the vocalist is saying. This becomes an issue if the band is way too loud because they only have so much headroom. There are times where the power of the PA hasn't been considered for the genre of music that's going to be playing in the room, and you're just kind of stuck, and you're both in this position of being like, well, we play in a loud band, that's part of the intensity, but we're not going to be able to hear the vocals. So what you do, the sound person wants you to turn down. It doesn't really work for your music. The venue hasn't installed a strong enough PA to have the music that they want to have performing there, and so it's frustrating, right? So immediately the sound person is going to be frustrated because then what is their job then? What are they doing? They're setting up a microphone for looks, and they're turning the PA, and they have it cranked so loud that the vocals are distorting. You can't hear the words anyway, and it doesn't make their job fun. Sometimes they're at a disadvantage, and that also is partly due to the booker of the room and them not vetting what's coming into the room. It can also happen when guitarists are unaware of how they're using volume. This goes back to earlier of me mentioning about guitar players just leaving their volume on the same volume the whole time, not having any awareness of how it's projecting out front, and not playing with any dynamics, just inexperience, right? And I think that can frustrate sound people because it's not even really like it's a loud band. It's just one person in the band playing so loud it's overcoming everybody. I helped do sound a while ago at a venue, and friends were doing a show, and then there was a band on later, and the band on later had a guitar player whose volume was way out of context from the rest of the band. He was playing through a solid state amp, so it wasn't a matter of using the amp to get the tone. I think it just was inexperience, because then when the fuzz pedal came on, the fuzz pedal was so much lower than the clean sound. It wasn't gain staged well, and it didn't sound good. It was no way to balance. The vocals couldn't get any louder, and it didn't have to be that way. It wasn't necessarily a matter of it being a wrong match for the venue. It was a matter of a contextual situation, right? It was the band that didn't require that kind of volume from one instrument, thus it was out of balance and tied the hands of the sound engineer. There was nothing you can do. So it does require responsibility and thought into why you're playing loud and how you're playing loud, and trying to make sure that you minimize that to make it easier for the sound person so they actually have a job and they could enjoy what they're doing. When you walk into a room, don't just throw your amp down on the floor and turn it on and start playing your full gig volume. Start low, walk out in front of the amplifier, listen to how it's reverberating in the room or reflecting, and start easing into it a little bit. Turn on some pedals, put the plexiglass in front of the amps, and the sound person sees that you're trying to figure out the room, and then you're not going to send them to like freak out mode, right? You're probably still going to end up having some conflicts at some time, and you'll have to resort maybe to doing some of the tips that I talked about, which is not playing at your full volume until the gig starts. But at least if you start here, you're going to reduce the amount of conflict considerably, and at least show that you're trying to meet them part way on the volume issue. And back to a earlier topic of the amp wattage, there are some people that say there's not that much difference in volume between a 15 watt amp and a 30 watt amp. There's some science behind that, but there is a very different bass projection that happens between a 15 watt amp and a 30 or 50 watt amp, thus making it take up more space. So a smaller amp isn't going to put out as much low end, which is something that you have to consider when you're developing your sound. But taking like a Hot Rod DeVille or a 50 watt amp into a tiny room, that low end push is going to like take up so much more space and create a sense of much more volume than a 15 watt amp is, which has a little less push in it as far as that's considered. That's where choosing the right amplifier can also help you in another room, and is also one of my issues with smaller rooms that put really loud amps into them with too much headroom. It's hard to control, not only volume wise, but also just the sheer like full out frequency projection of them becomes overwhelming very quickly. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I hope it's given you some perspective of maybe how to deal with amps when you want to push some volume on a gig, and how the other side, aka the sound crew, thinks or feels when they're dealing with your amp volume. It's not a simple solution to any of this stuff. Obviously, I still deal with the conflicts myself. I'm always trying to find ways to reduce it, but there is only so much you can reduce it when it's part of our instrument. Try to take the steps you can to make it a less stressful experience, and hopefully just enjoy making music instead of being at war with the person on the other side. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another podcast. You can reach me at anatomyofguitartone.com if you're interested in lessons. It'd be great if you left me a review about this podcast. It helps the algorithm and more people find this podcast that might be interested in the content. And until then, I hope you have a fun couple of weeks of sonic exploration.